My parents sold my car to finance my brother's wedding. 3 years later, they called me in despair because he had lost everything and needed a place to live. A few years ago, when I was in my last year of high school, my parents bought me a used car as a birthday present. It wasn't anything luxurious, but it was mine. And for me, it represented independence. I loved that old sedan. I took care of it as if it were a luxury car, washing it every week and saving up to fix small details like the air conditioning that never worked well. The car was my escape. We lived in a small town in Kansas where there wasn't much to do. So having a car meant I could drive anywhere, from the mall to the movie theater in the nearest city. It was a freedom that I valued greatly. My parents had always been a bit hard on me. I am the youngest of 3 siblings. And to be honest, I always felt like the last on the list of priorities. My older brother was the genius of the family, and my middle sister was the artist. I, for my part, was always the one who had to work harder to stand out. That's why when my parents gave me the car, I thought they were finally recognizing me a little. Maybe they were proud of me after all. But that illusion didn't last long. A few months after receiving my car, my brother announced that he was marrying his girlfriend of years. Everyone in the family was excited, and my parents, in particular, were ecstatic about the idea of organizing a big wedding. They wanted everything to be perfect, an elegant venue, gourmet food, an incredible DJ, the dream wedding dress for their future daughter-in-law. However, there was a small problem. We didn't have much money. My dad worked as a mechanic, and my mom was a cashier in a supermarket. We weren't in poverty, but we weren't rich either. I knew that a big wedding was not something we could afford without going into debt, and I assumed it was just another exaggeration from my parents. One day, while I was in class, I received a text message from my mom that said, "Please don't be alarmed, but we need to talk about something important tonight." I felt a small knot in my stomach because I knew that when my mom used that phrase, it rarely brought good news. That night, after dinner, my parents asked me to sit down with them. My dad, visibly uncomfortable, went straight to the point. "We know how much you value your car, but we believe we all have to make sacrifices for the good of the family. We've decided to sell it to help with the costs of your brother's wedding." I was silent for a moment, then asked in disbelief, "My car? The one you gave me? The one I take care of and maintain with my own money?" My mom nodded, trying to soften it. "Sweetheart, we thought you'd understand. It's for your brother. The wedding is something important for him, for the whole family." I tried to reason with them. I explained how I used the car to go to school, to my part-time job, and that I had become dependent on it. But they didn't want to listen. "We can arrange for you to take the bus," my dad said, as if it were an obvious and simple solution. The worst thing of all was that they didn't even ask for my opinion before making the decision. They had already sold it that same morning. All that was left of the car was a feeling of emptiness in the garage and an envelope with cash on the table. Destined for my brother's wedding. I felt a mixture of rage, sadness, and betrayal. But in my family, raising your voice or arguing with your parents never ended well. So, I simply got up from the table and locked myself in my room. That was the first time I realized that in my family, I would always be last on the list of priorities. The months that followed after the sale of my car were a real emotional hell for me. Although I tried to move on, I couldn't help but feel invisible. My brother, on the other hand, seemed to be on top of the world. Every conversation at home revolved around the plans for his wedding. The menu, the centerpieces, the suits. All of that while I took the bus every morning to work and then to school. The most frustrating thing was that no one seemed to notice what I was sacrificing. Neither my brother nor his fiancée mentioned the car once. Not even a superficial thank you. It was as if everything I had done had no value. The wedding day arrived, and I must admit it was impressive. The ceremony was in an elegant hall on the outskirts of town, and everything was perfectly planned. My parents were going around making sure everything went perfectly. I, for my part, felt like a stranger in my own family. I had tried to smile and act as if everything was fine, but inside I couldn't help but feel resentful. I had worked hard to save money, take care of my car, and all of that had vanished in the blink of an eye. After the wedding, I thought things would calm down, and that maybe my sacrifice would somehow be recognized. But the reality was different. My brother and his wife started to depend even more on my parents. First, they were small loans to cover unexpected expenses. Then the payment of a vacation they needed because organizing a wedding had been too stressful. My relationship with my brother, which was already somewhat distant, deteriorated completely. I couldn't look at him without remembering what I had lost for his wedding. I tried to focus on my studies and my work, but the resentment was still there, slowly growing in the back of my mind. A couple of years passed, and while I continued to work hard to save money for college, my brother's life began to fall apart. At first, it was something subtle. Rumors that he had lost his job and was having trouble finding another. Then his wife started spending more time at her parents' house. And finally, the news that she had decided to separate. My brother returned to my parents' house with a suitcase and a defeated expression. Despite everything, my parents welcomed him with open arms, as they always had. I, on the other hand, felt divided between compassion and frustration. The weeks turned into months, and during that time, my brother made no effort to rebuild his life. He spent his days watching television on the couch and going out with friends at night. My parents, though visibly tired, continued to finance everything for him, his food, his clothes, and even his nights out. One day, while I was in my room reviewing some homework, I heard my parents arguing in the living room. It wasn't something usual since they almost never confronted each other. I left my room, and although I didn't want to get involved, I couldn't help but listen when my dad raised his voice. "We can't keep financing this. We're running out of savings. And he's not doing anything on his own. He hasn't even looked for a job in months." My mom, always protective of my brother, tried to justify him. "He's going through a bad time. He needs our support." That's when, for the first time in a long time, I decided to intervene. "Why does it always have to be your responsibility? Have you ever thought about what I need? You sold my car to finance his wedding, and now you're not even considering setting a limit. This isn't fair." My dad fell silent, but my mom looked at me with a mixture of surprise and pain. "You know that everything we do is for the good of the family. You've always been strong, and we trust that you can handle these things on your own." That was it. I couldn't take it anymore. Handle it on my own? Sure. As always. While I'm breaking my back to save money. He's here living for free without lifting a finger. If that's what you consider family, then I don't want to be a part of it. After that discussion, there was an awkward silence in the house. No one mentioned the subject for several days, but the tensions were evident. My parents barely spoke to me, and my brother seemed to pretend that I didn't exist. For my part, I locked myself in my own world, focusing on my work and my studies. However, the situation at home continued to deteriorate. My brother didn't make the slightest attempt to change. He spent his days watching television, playing video games, or going out with friends. Every time someone tried to talk to him about looking for a job, he simply excused himself, saying that he was still processing everything that had happened with his marriage. My parents, as much as they tried to justify him, began to show signs of exhaustion. Money was disappearing quickly, and although my dad continued to work long hours, they barely managed to keep up with the bills, the debts, and my brother's expenses. One night, while we were having dinner, my dad finally spoke. "We can't keep going on like this. We have to make a decision. I don't know how much longer we can keep this up." He pointed at my brother with a seriousness he rarely showed. "You need to get on your feet and find a solution." My brother sighed as if he were being unfairly attacked. "And what do you want me to do? It's not that easy to find a job now. Everyone is going through things. We're all going through things," I replied, unable to contain myself any longer. "But you're not even making any effort. You haven't sent a single resume or even looked for a temporary job all this time. You've just been taking advantage of it." My brother looked at me with contempt but said nothing. Instead of answering, he simply got up from the table and went to his room, as he always did when someone confronted him. My parents said nothing, but their faces said it all. A few weeks after that conversation, things reached a critical point. One day, I came home from work and found my parents sitting on the couch with somber faces. There were papers on the table, bills, bank statements, and what seemed to be a letter from the bank. My mom looked on the verge of tears while my dad spoke. We're running out of money. We barely managed to pay the mortgage this month. And the credit card is almost maxed out. If we keep going like this, we could lose the house. For a moment, I was silent, trying to process what I had just heard. My mind was blank. But then a feeling of indignation washed over me. And what do you plan to do about it? Are you going to keep supporting him until we all end up on the street? My mom tried to defend herself. He's your brother. He's part of the family. We can't just throw him out. And what about me? Am I not part of this family? Doesn't everything I've done count? You sold my car to finance his wedding. And now, after everything he's done, you're still defending him. It was at that moment when my dad, usually quiet in these types of discussions, stood up and spoke in a firm voice. We can't keep going on like this. We have to do something before it's too late. That night, they decided that my brother had to move out. They gave him an ultimatum. He had 3 months to find a job and start paying his part, or he would have to leave. When they gave him the news, my brother reacted in the most predictable way possible, with an outburst of anger. You're really going to kick me out after everything I've been through? I'm your son. For God's sake. We're not kicking you out. But you have to do something on your own. We can't keep supporting you indefinitely, my dad replied, trying to remain calm. My brother didn't want to listen to them. He packed a few things and left the house that same night, leaving the rest of his belongings behind. He didn't say where he was going, and no one bothered to ask. That was the last time we saw him for a while. The following months were strangely calm at home. My parents seemed dejected but also relieved not to have the constant burden of my brother in their lives. Little by little, they began to catch up on their debts and stabilize their finances. I continued with my life, although I still felt a mixture of resentment and sadness. As frustrating as my brother was to me, he was still family. I wondered where he was and how he was managing, but I never dared to ask. Things finally seemed to be returning to normal until one afternoon I received an unexpected call. It was my mom, and her voice was trembling as she spoke. We need you to come home. Your brother is here, and we need your help. When my mom called me, I didn't know what to expect. Her tone was so serious, so full of urgency, that I had no time to hesitate. I left what I was doing and drove home immediately. Upon arriving, I saw my brother's car parked in front of the house. Although I barely recognized it, it was dirty, with a flat tire and full of dents. I entered the door and found him sitting on the couch with his head in his hands, while my parents watched him from the dining room table. The atmosphere was heavy, tense, as if everyone were holding their breath. What happened? I asked, trying to stay calm. My brother looked up at me, and for the first time in years, I saw him vulnerable. His eyes were red, his hair disheveled, and he was wearing the same clothes he had probably been wearing for several days. He looked defeated. I lost everything, he murmured. My parents began to explain. After leaving home, my brother had tried to live on his own, but things hadn't gone as he expected. He had lost his job shortly after leaving, unable to pay the rent. He was evicted. Since then, he had been sleeping in his car and depending on friends for food. And what do you want me to do? I asked, trying to control the anger that was starting to bubble in my chest. My mom intervened before he could answer. He needs a place to stay. We thought maybe you could help him. It was as if the air had escaped from my lungs. I looked at my parents in disbelief. Are you saying you want me to take him to my apartment? To take care of him? Not forever, my dad said in a voice that tried to be reassuring. Only until he stabilizes a little. I was silent, processing their words. I felt a mixture of emotions, anger, frustration, but also a little pity. My brother, as irresponsible as he was, seemed like a completely broken man. But that didn't change the fact that I had spent years feeling relegated because of him, sacrificing things for him without anyone acknowledging it. Why can't he stay here? I finally asked. My parents looked at each other uncomfortably. My mom spoke first. It's that we can't anymore. Your dad and I are tired. We love your brother. But this situation has been too much. If he stays here, we won't be able to truly help him. For a moment, I thought about refusing outright. I had worked too hard to build my life away from the shadows of my brother and my parents. But something in me stopped. I looked at my brother, who could barely look up. "Okay," I said at last in a cold tone. "But only for a few weeks. And I want to make something clear, if you don't make an effort to change, you're leaving." My parents seemed relieved. But my brother said nothing. He just nodded as if accepting my help was the last nail in the coffin of his pride. The first few days of having my brother in my small apartment were awkward. He barely spoke, spending most of the time sleeping or sitting in front of the television. Although he looked defeated, there was still something in his attitude that bothered me. A kind of apathy that made me think he wasn't taking advantage of this new opportunity. After a week, I decided to confront him. "If you're going to stay here, you need to do something. I'm not going to support you." My brother sighed and nodded slowly. "I'm looking for a job," he said in a weak voice. "Really? Or are you just saying that to get me off your back?" That question made him react. He looked at me with some anger in his eyes. "It's not as easy as you think. Not everyone is as lucky as you." That made me snap. "Lucky? Do you think my life has been luck? I worked for everything I have. While you wasted our parents' money, I was taking buses, working overtime, and studying late. This has nothing to do with luck. It has to do with responsibility." My brother didn't answer. He was silent for a long time before murmuring, "I'm sorry." I didn't expect to hear those words from him. And for a moment, I didn't know what to say. Over time, my brother began to make small efforts. He went out more often to drop off job applications and began to help with the chores in the apartment. Despite my skepticism, he seemed to be trying to change. One day, he came home with a shy smile. "I got a job," he said. It was a basic position in a warehouse, but it was a start. And although it was hard for me to admit, I felt a little proud of him. For the first time in years, he seemed to be taking control of his life. However, my relationship with my parents remained tense. Although they were grateful that I had agreed to help my brother, they had made no effort to reconcile with me. They hadn't mentioned the sale of my car or the decisions they made in the past. I decided to let it go for the moment. I was no longer looking for their approval. As the weeks went by, my brother began to take steps forward. He wasn't perfect, but seeing that he was genuinely trying to improve helped me relieve some of the resentment I had accumulated for years. Even so, living together wasn't easy. Old patterns don't disappear overnight. And there were days when he would fall back into his apathy. However, every time that happened, I confronted him firmly. And to my surprise, he responded positively, accepting his mistakes. Meanwhile, my parents did not stop trying to get involved. Every few days, my mom would call me to ask how my brother was, if he needed anything, or to suggest that I be more patient with him. Her calls irritated me, but I decided to ignore them. I knew there was no point in arguing. The old dynamics were back. Everything seemed to be at a point of equilibrium until one afternoon. While my brother and I were having dinner, I received a call from my mom. I answered, expecting another trivial question about how my brother was. But what she said left me frozen. "We're thinking of selling the house," she said in a tone of voice that tried to sound casual. "What? Why?" I asked, bewildered. "Your dad and I are considering moving to a smaller place. The house is too big for the two of us. And we've thought that we could help your brother with part of the money. He could use it to get better established. Maybe get a better place to live." I felt the anger rise again in my chest. "Are you serious? Sell the house to keep helping him? He's just starting to get back on his feet. This isn't going to solve his problems in the long run." My mom tried to calm me. "It's only temporary. We know he's improving. But he still needs a push." I hung up the call before she could say more. I couldn't believe it. Once again, my parents were willing to sacrifice everything for my brother, without thinking about the consequences. When I told my brother what they had said, I expected him to agree with them, as always. But to my surprise, he was visibly uncomfortable. "I don't want them to do that," he said in a low voice. "I've taken too much from them already. I can't keep dragging them down with me." His words surprised me. For the first time, he seemed to understand the impact of his actions on our family. That conversation marked a turning point. My brother began to work more hours in his job. And soon after, he got a second job as a delivery driver. Although it wasn't ideal, he was doing it. He also started to save money. even offering to pay part of the apartment expenses. One day, while we were having breakfast, he looked at me and said, "Thank you for not giving up on me." I didn't know how to respond to him. For years, I had accumulated so much resentment that I never imagined I could feel anything else. But at that moment, I felt something I didn't expect: pride. Over time, my brother got a place of his own. It wasn't anything luxurious, but it was his. And that meant everything to him. We continued to see each other from time to time. And although our relationship isn't perfect, it's much better than it used to be. On the other hand, my relationship with my parents is still complicated. Although they have tried to reach out to me, they have not yet fully acknowledged how their decisions affected me. But I have come to accept that maybe they never will.